On January 23rd, 1855, a bridge opened over the Mississippi River in a place we call Minneapolis. Naturalist and zoologist Clinton Hart Merriam, who would later name and document dozens of mammals across North America, was born that year, as was astronomer Percival Lowell, who suggested Mars was inhabited by intelligent life and predicted the eventual discovery of Pluto. Former Congressman Abraham Lincoln lost an election to represent Illinois in the U.S. Senate. An opera based on the story Rip Van Winkle premiered. Two towns called Northfield and Faribault in the young Minnesota Territory were platted out. This is the 1855 History Podcast, a podcast about Minnesota, the 19th century, and doing history. With me today, for the last time, our farewell concert.
That's right.
Is my documentary producing partner, Logan Leatherman. Logan! This
Hello,
is
Sam.
it. This is it, bud. We'll never talk again after today.
I know. Yeah, it's a big deal. We have been on a long journey. It's taken us 9 weeks to...
We skipped a week. I think it was 10. We skipped a week.
There you go. But we finally made it to the final episode of Ken Burns' 1990 Civil War documentary series, which, look back on where we were 10 weeks ago when we had not even the inkling of an idea of what lay ahead of us.
Just think, Logan, back then, we had not even watched the Ken Burns Civil War documentary series. Isn't that just crazy to imagine a world?
We had hardly thought about Shelby Foote at that point. We had
Shelby Foote.
Scarcely heard a word from him.
What is that, a podiatrist condition?
Right.
Is that a
Exactly.
Shelby Foote? Do I need to get a Shelby Foote checked out? Do I need to get
Listen, Sam, I'm hearing you loud and clear.
That's Shelby too.
There totally is. And that's all we were back then. 10 weeks ago, we were just making puns about Shelby Foote. We were just...
babes in the woods.
We were babes in the woods, babes in the wilderness. But now...
The Battle of the Wilderness.
That's right. But here we are. We finally did it. We set out at the beginning to check this box off of our bucket list as history kids. And here we are. So I think we're ready to jump into how Ken Burns manages the pretty mammoth task of bringing this entire series to a close. He's decided to take many, many hours to tell the story of the Civil War. And in some ways, the most important steps are the first episode and the last episode. How do you set it up? How do you establish the stakes? And then how do you bring it all together at the end and establish a meaning for it with your audience? So let's talk a little bit about how Ken Burns does that and what works for us and what didn't.
Yeah. So I think these last two episodes are some of the most solid pieces of documentary that this series has. And part of that's the methodology, part of it is making it work in the broader narrative, and part of it is making the individual episode as narratively and historically compelling as possible. And you can, at least the benefit of seeing how the style has progressed over the years and seeing the influence that the Ken Burns style has had on documentary storytelling as a whole, I feel like you can really see the formula being worked out as this series in particular continues. And by the last two episodes, I feel like they've got it. They've got these different elements, and I think they've got them down. The mix of historical footage with contemporary footage, this last episode, Logan, one thing I really loved about it is it relies so heavily on those primary source quotes, the voices from the time. I think there is the longest stretch of time in any of the episodes in this last episode where it is either the narrator controlling the narrative or its primary sources. We don't see a lot of historians in this episode, not until really the end. There's a brief Barbara Fields and Shelby Foote appearances in the cold open, which I thought was done really well. But largely, this episode, mostly because there's so much ground to cover, is led by a narrator and those primary sources. It's led by the editor, by the storyteller. It feels like Ken Burns allowed himself the most narrative control in this episode, or at least a more direct narrative control. I thought that was really interesting, and I found this episode extremely compelling.
I have to agree on
You have to.
the importance of the primary sources there. It's really like, I don't know, that's what this style does best, is when you can bring a face through the photographs and then a voice through actors reading the quotes is as close as this style can get to bringing a historical figure back, is when you can get an image for the person who lived in this other time. You get a picture of George Templeton Strong or Horace Greeley or whoever's talking, and you have someone read their words in a compelling and interesting way, and you incorporate that effectively into a narrative. That's what Ken Burns does best. With Elijah Hunt Rhodes, with Sam Watkins. This is his peach cobbler. This is his special treat that he knows how to make, is he knows how to identify individuals from history who have something important to say to us about this event 150 years later, in their own words, in their own time, and delivering it to us in an effective way. And I think you're 100% right that this episode was a particularly strong example of that technique.
Yeah, you and I have waxed poetical about this quite a bit. But at its core, history is most powerful when it's used for empathy.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most natural use of history is to create empathy for people who have come before us, to either better understand them, better understand the times, better understand the circumstances we find ourselves in today. The initial attraction, Ken Burns has spoken about this, for him was these historical photographs. And I think you're right. With someone who's already naturally curious about history, a historical photograph or a primary source, those things can transport you. You and I have talked about this, Logan. When you and I are piecing a narrative together in our head from different primary sources, whether it's in archives or we're reading an oral history that's been transcribed or anything like that, that gets our imaginations firing and we are transported to these places. But for folks who aren't already historically engaged, that's where storytellers like Ken Burns can really be magical by pairing those different elements together, pairing the music, the sound design, the sound effects, the historical photographs, the actors' interpretations. That can almost give an approximation of what it feels like to uncover something in the archives. It feels like to be piecing together this astonishing and beautiful narrative. And there are glimpses in this episode that really do that so effectively. And one thing on photographs, he talks about how thousands of photographs were lost in the wake of the war. And so what we have surviving is really only a fraction of what was taken and what could have been preserved to tell the story. But initially, people were not interested in remembering the Civil War, or at least the gruesome sides that some of those pictures might have encapsulated. But let's talk a little bit about the plot that this episode covers. This is really the aftermath of the war. Last week set up the assassination conspiracy against Lincoln. This episode assassinated Lincoln. And you and I have talked a great deal about great man history and when it's appropriate and when it's not. And this episode, I think, straddled it, but I think it did it well. It focused on the elements of the assassination that were really important for the public, important for understanding the plot itself. And this, to me, this last piece, here, let's have a little build up to this.
Huh.
There was an element to this that I thought was essential in doing, if you're delving at all into great man history, because genuinely, there are figures in history who, because of their status, whether it's an elected position or a birthright or just right place, right time, are genuinely important.
Yeah.
And have reached a genuine status of reverence. This is the main stretch where I'm talking about where it's only the narrator or its primary sources. It's around the Lincoln assassination and the death.
Yeah.
The assassination is almost entirely covered by narration. In Lincoln's death, we have different characters of the time essentially eulogizing Lincoln. And the early work, I think Frederick Douglass was one of the voices, essentially deifying. And we see that happening in real time. People of his time beginning to create this myth around this mortal man. But for me, what works about that is it's the people of the time doing the deifying.
Yeah.
By showing Frederick Douglass or whoever else talking about what an amazing, a larger than life man Lincoln was, it tells us something about how he was viewed at the time. If there was Shelby Foote's evil twin brother with an upside down mustache coming in talking about how great Lincoln was. Shelby Foote also praised Lincoln, to be fair. I'm just making a little color here. If we had a historian from 1990 telling us about what a monumental figure Lincoln was, to me, that's not as effective, and it doesn't actually tell us as much about it. So I thought that was done really well. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on how the whole Lincoln assassination went in this episode.
I think you're right that the only way to do that particular thing is to illustrate in very particular ways what it meant at the time. And that is what the episode is. It's tracking, especially in the tracking of Lincoln's funerary train from D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, and in detail discussing many of the stops along the way. How many people turned out? What kind of conditions were they in when they came out? Did they stuck around through the rain? They brought their umbrellas. They brought their whole families out just to see this train as it passed by. Talking about pictures in towns throughout the United States where people had hung banners mourning Abraham Lincoln. That's capturing what it means for individual Americans at that time, in addition to the quotes. I love returning to Walt Whitman throughout this series.
I love those additions. That was great.
The Whitman quotes are really incredible because he's a man for whom the Civil War had just unbelievable meaning. And the things that to us, when we were growing up, Sam, we had reverence for Abraham Lincoln, reverence for Gettysburg, reverence for all these symbols of the Civil War. Walt Whitman had that reverence too in the time. He recognized the symbolic power of the figures of the Civil War, and it really mattered to him. And so you get someone like a genius poet like Walt Whitman who's thinking about all these things deeply. And you also have someone who's participating in the most brutal part of it, something like Sam Watkins' quote that begins the episode, where he asks, was it all real? All these things I experienced, these horrific events that I made it through, that this nation has undergone, could that possibly have been real? We couldn't possibly praise enough the digging into hearing from regular people what it means to them that the Civil War has ended, that Lincoln has been assassinated. It's really extraordinary to be able to listen to people from 150 years ago, and it's well done here. So we get the assassination of Lincoln, we get the death of John Wilkes Booth, we get the trial of his conspirators, and then we start to go into a segment returning back to a very large rogues gallery of the various characters we've met along the way in this long series. What do you think about that section, Sam?
Yeah, I thought it was good. You need to tie up those loose ends, these different figures that we've heard about at various points through the series. Hearing about Jefferson Davis's, the manhunt, the imprisonment, and then the later life where he continued to be a proponent of the lost cause and essentially grew into old age under as normal circumstances as you could, having led a country that very briefly and no longer exists. There were a few details that I thought was that were new to me or hit me in a different way. One was the steamboat after the war.
Yeah, the Sultana.
Going up the river with Union prisoners, and it exploded and killed countless individuals. I thought that was tragic and a story that I hadn't heard before. I thought the one piece that we should mention, to be fair, they brought up Nathan Bedford Forrest and talked about him being part of the KKK. So I've begged on about that in a handful of episodes, so I thought it only fair to bring it up that it was brought up in this episode. I can nitpick exactly how it was brought up and how it was framed, but I've spoken enough about Nathan Bedford Forrest, I think, for the year 2021. And one thing that was interesting, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens was reelected, and there was a quote, I think it was from the narrator, as though there were no Confederacy. I thought that was an extremely effective way of putting it and really giving us the history of the end of Reconstruction without actually getting into the history of the end of Reconstruction. And especially when we get into the footage of more veterans, we talk about the veterans reenacting Pickett's charge, but having it end in a hug rather than obviously violence, really showing the willful effort on the part of the American people to not think about the war, and if you had to think about the war, to really attempt to put it behind you. And I actually might walk that back a little bit. They wanted to put the horrors of war behind them, but I was actually doing research for an upcoming documentary of ours, and for years and years there was constant coverage of Decorating Day, or a day to commemorate the Civil War. And it would be Confederate and Union troops. And even newspapers in the North that I were looking at had this good old boys, this sort of softening of the fight. And the newspapers I was looking at was only 10 years on from the war itself, which I thought was really fascinating. And Fields and Foote and this whole another rogues gallery of the historians that we've been hearing from come back to sort of round out the war, talk about the effects, talk about the legacy. That some pieces definitely feel like they're missing elements of the conversation that might have been had today, but so much of what was brought up. Our discourse around the Civil War feels like it's come so far in recent years, but looking at how it was discussed in 1990.
Yeah.
By these group of historians and Civil War enthusiasts isn't really too far developed from where we are now. We've had a long time of, we really need to be starting this conversation. And It doesn't sound like we've been starting it for quite a while, but the conversation really began in how people wanted to frame it as soon as there was peace, as soon as Appomattox was signed. I'm curious how you felt about the sort of legacy portion of this episode, Logan.
Barbara Fields is a really incredible historian and writer. Again, I think in her first appearance, I think I shouted out her book, Racecraft, which is very good. So shout it out again here. But her diagnosis of the meaning of the Civil War was really illuminating and brought it out to a much broader meaning than I had ever that I've ever seen it brought to before, and a really sort of transcendent meaning. I think her last line was something like, as long as there are some people living in homes and some people living on the streets, the Civil War is still being fought, and regrettably it can still be lost. I think that was her last line. And just the idea that both the specific ruptures that the Civil War was caused by and attempted to close are still around, but also that the sort of there was a larger meaning to the Civil War that was about human liberation, is a word that gets tossed around, actually not by Barbara Fields, but by, I think, Stephen B. Oates in talking about how it justified democracy and democratic government. And there's something to be said about the Civil War as, by its end, becoming a struggle about human liberation in some way. It is sort of a all-encompassing argument then against injustice, against the moral wrong in society, is that, the blood that was shed, the lives that were lost in this conflict were fought in the service of a much higher cause than ending the Confederacy or preserving the United States. In that way, it is very much applicable to today. And also, crucially, that fight as a struggle continues today, which she was talking about in 1990, and 30 years later, I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue against. So that was and I have rarely heard it expressed like that. Obviously, I think to give that side of the argument on the legacy of the Civil War credit, obviously that central view that the Civil War was a struggle about racism in some way, and that therefore any continued struggle against racism in the 20th or 21st centuries is an extension of the Civil War in some way. That has fairly broad cachet in the broader culture right now, I would say. Certainly among various parts of the culture. I think in the last 30 years that has become more mainstream. if equally contentious. But her broader point about the Civil War, about this idea that, again, the specific line that really struck me, as long as there are some people living in homes and some people living on the streets, the Civil War is still being fought and regrettably can still be lost. That's not something that I see represented a lot in culture today, 30 years later. And it calls for us to continue to rethink the Civil War and constantly be reconsidering what it means to us and what it was actually all about. So I thought that was a great section. Yeah.
Yeah. Vitally, I think what Field's call to action is application. And maybe where I'm feeling like the conversation in many ways has spread, but I feel in many ways has stalled as well, is sometimes we get so caught up on trying to reckon with the past that we don't take that next step of applying this new reality that we've accepted. And to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on what the definition of about is. Was the Civil War about slavery, or was it about racism? Arguably, it became about racism to the people who lived it at a certain point in the war. Politically, it certainly became about that. But if you ask Lincoln in 1861, it might not have been. But historians can't decide what a war was about, just as much as any individual from the time cannot tell you what something is about or what it is for or what caused it specifically, because all of the thousands of people that were involved had shared some abouts, but each could have their own about. So I think the broader conversation of what is the Civil War about, it's the about that we ascribe to it in the present. It's the about that changes over time depending on who is telling the story and who is hearing the story. I think we get so caught up in, well, actually, the historically accurate thing is this. And that's valid if you're looking at it from that perspective. But largely, the modern conversation about history is the application of that history. The reaction to the living with history is not passive.
Right.
Living with history requires that application. So when we say, what was the Civil War about? We don't mean what was it about to the people who died 150 years ago. We mean, what is it about to you? What does living in a world, in a country where this happened, where this is essential to, in many ways, how all of us are living our lives this very moment? What is it about to the person learning about it? What is it about to the person living with that history? And I think this documentary, from Fields to Foote to everyone in between, in this legacy section, we really wrap it up with that deep and, I think, enlightened understanding of, when we ask what this war was about, we mean it in a contemporary sense. And that's where I hope we can really begin to get past where this conversation has been since the war ended, since the war was ongoing. What is this about in the literal, to being more, what is this about in the abstract for us personally? And I thought that was all done really well. And hopefully this documentary series was, and possibly continues to be. That's one thing that we need to talk about, Logan. Is this series still good? Still a good series to be a learning tool for the Civil War?
Right.
Does this hold up?
Right. Yeah. We have now seen the entire series. And so we come to our, really the final question, which is it any good? Is it worth keeping around? Obviously, you're going to keep it around, but is it worth watching?
It's available on archive.com in case you're wondering.
Yeah. Is it worth propagating upon middle schoolers or unsuspecting friends and relatives? It's actually
How did you experience documentaries, Logan? It was either propagated upon you in middle school or thrust upon you by relatives. For someone who makes documentaries, I'm kind of wondering what the origin of your relationship with them was.
Well, I think that's how a lot of people are with documentaries. Is it's not a situation you invite yourself into. We talked at the beginning about how there's some trappings of this particular style that are roadblocks, which is the speed or lack thereof, the technically the limits to the action on screen. But that being said, I think we have concluded numerous times that at least several episodes are very effective documentaries, even on their own. We have concluded that Ken Burns knows how to make a documentary, and he's very good at it.
If we're only coming to that conclusion now, we're slow learners because we've watched 9 of them.
That's right. I'm glad that I watched it.
Me too. So when our dentists and our hairdressers and our skateboard salesman asks us, and our grocers and everything, we can say, yes, we have watched it.
And that's the right question. That's the right way to put the question, which is,
say it back to me. What was the right way to put the question?
Would I recommend it to a friend? Yes, I would. If someone says to me, is it worth watching the Ken Burns Civil War documentary? I would say, don't be ashamed of spreading it out over 10 weeks if you need to, in order to give yourself time to watch it all. In fact, that's a pretty good way of doing it, but it is worth doing. It is, like we've talked about before, it has left an imprint on the culture. And you feel that when watching it. You feel the ways that it has influenced other things that you've seen as you watch it. So it's worth watching in that way. I think it's illuminating the ways it gets the Civil War wrong and the ways it gets the Civil War right. I think both of those are interesting and worth knowing and shed light on what the Civil War means to us in both of those ways.
Yeah, I would recommend it to a friend or a relative who I think is already interested in history, already interested in the Civil War. I wouldn't recommend it, I think, for a middle schooler. I think it can serve to spark an interest in history, but I think with the accessibility of so many new mediums and so many new creators who are more specifically geared to do just that.
Right.
This series certainly runs the risk of having the opposite effect. But I do think it's effective for people who are already engaged with the history, already interested in they're viewing this not critically in a sense that they're not enjoying it, but critically they're thinking about it as opposed to taking it at face value. They use it as a tool for engaging their historical brain. But I think if you're looking to spark something, if you're looking to introduce someone to the subject, I think there are better tools out there, at least in the year 2021. In the year 1990, I'm not sure there was.
How do we want to wrap this up?
Is this farewell, Mr. Ledman?
I think it might be. Although, yes, I am very sad to take a permanent end to this. The pain is lessened only a little bit by the fact that we will be recording immediately after this another episode.
Yes, we will.
So it's slightly less permanent.
Due until the Patreon bonus episode. Although if people want to get more of this conversation, we'll be talking a little bit more with some time removed, a whole week removed, in fact, on a Facebook live stream that will be taking place on Tuesday, November 23rd at 7 o'clock Central Time. That is 7 o'clock Central Time. Logan and I will be doing a Facebook live stream on the 1855 history team. We might be screening bits and pieces or an entire documentary, having a Q&A session discussing this podcast series and some of the benefits of becoming a patron, which we mentioned we're going to record a bonus podcast for. So thank you for listening. Thank you for going on this exciting journey with us in a way, Logan. This was our own personal Civil Wars.
I'm not going to sign on to that.
Let me try that again. The real Civil War.
No.
Is the memories we made along the way. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful Civil War.
All right. So give me one more. Give me one more.
Okay. Gotta get deep. I was gonna do like a rosebud thing, but just have it be Civil War, but that would just be me saying the word Civil War.
That's right. Yeah, it'd be hard to make that work. Come on, you got one more in you. I know you do.
This is in honor of Ulysses S. Grant. 'Twas beauty that killed the Civil War.
Until next time, Sam. Goodbye forever.
Great.